Welcome to another episode of L&D Go Beyond podcast. Today, we have Toby Harris with us. Toby is the Director of Product Marketing at Filtered. And Filtered is a learning tech company that helps organizations get the best return on their L&D spend. That means using data to decide on the most important skills for an organization, then analyzing which content is helping build them and filtering out the rest. And finally, getting that content to the people that need it via their LXP and multi-channel campaigns. Toby has been in various different roles earlier, including sales, marketing, and project management. So he does bring in a well-rounded perspective to the discussion today. The topic of our discussion today is curation and learning ecosystems, and we focus on how to deal with the complexity that damages learning culture. Now, that's quite a mouthful, but I'm very happy to have you on the show, Toby. Very welcome.
Thank you, Amit. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Now, I'm very excited by this topic. It has quite a few things that are focus areas for a lot of L&D folks, for me as well. But before we get started, I'd love to hear from you, and our audience would like to know a little bit about your story, what has been your journey like, and what takes you today?
Great question to start off with. So I've worked in some form of the learning technology space for pretty much all of my career so far. And I've seen a lot of how the industry and the technology and the approaches have evolved, done everything from scripting and producing bespoke e-learning content to selling it, to project managing it, to coming up with ideas for platforms. And in particular, I think maybe this is not a thing to say you're proud of, but something I'm most proud of has been my role and the role of companies I've worked for, especially Filtered, in bringing about this move towards learning experience platforms. So even before joining Filtered, I did some thinking about this. I attempted to coin the term learning experience network in 2014, 2015. That didn't fly. Obviously, Berson's LXP was better. He's good at naming things. And then at Filtered, I had the privilege of helping to, bring to fruition a recommendation technology, and in particular, a kind of interface where there's some personalization up front and you're straight into relevant, inspiring, interesting content, help to bring that to market. Now, we've learned a lot from all of that. And we've also learned a lot from the LXP market itself and potentially some of the challenges there. But it's easy to forget what things were like before we had any idea of the LXP and how difficult the user experience of finding learning could be. And so that's at least one bit of a complexity we're going to talk about, which has been addressed to some extent. So yeah, I guess in terms of what ticks my boxes, what really inspires me is when I get the opportunity to work with clients who are not interested in doing things the way they've always been done, who are willing to break the rules, to make up new rules, to apply research, and to have challenging conversations inside their organizations. That is really exciting. And I guess the opposite applies to, what I don't enjoy is having to participate in the rigmarole of formalistic communications about learning. We all know that the words we're using don't mean what we say they mean. So yeah, that's the thing I don't like.
No, I completely get that. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. Wonderful. I didn't know that you had this term. You said 2014, learning experience network. Yeah, was it something?
It didn't take off. That's why you don't know about it.
But you were close. Your learning experience platform is probably some sort of a variant of that. If I can imagine, if you had been, trying to carve out a platform or a system from that. Fantastic. And just from what takes you today, so you are seeing significant number of organizations who are happy to break the rules and have those difficult conversations.
Yeah, I would say so. There's been a huge sea change in the past two or 3 years in particular, where learning research and learning science is starting to really exert an influence on decision making in large organizations, particularly in the enterprise, space where you'll have the cutting edge, the avant-garde of the industry. And that's beneficial because those research informed conversations about how the learning process really happens, how it's linked to performance, they will erode the kind of practices that are harming learning in organizations. And so I think it's really starting to take shape, and the conversations are starting to change.
Fantastic. No, absolutely. I'm equally excited about the amount of discussions that are beginning to happen around what really works in learning and based on learning science. And there are quite good books out there which are capturing the right things. Hopefully, it's only going to increase from here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So we get to our topic for today, which is, as I said, quite a mouthful: curation and learning systems, how to deal with the complexity that damages learning cultures. Let's break it up a bit and take it one bite at a time. Let's look at learning ecosystems, so that everybody gets it and we don't get confused, because there are just a lot of terms in that. So learning ecosystems, if you would like to, just explain, what do you mean by learning ecosystems? Is it an LMS, an LXP? Is it more than that? What are you really referring to?
Yeah. So there are two ways to look at what the learning ecosystem is. You can focus on what I would describe as actually existing learning. And that's the combination of the informal learning and problem solving and skill development that happens all the time, and all of the initiatives you don't control as L&D. So there's lots of stuff, right? There's apprenticeship programs that might not be in your realm of control. There might be institutional training practices that happen. That's like the natural ecosystem. And then on the other side, you've also got, what are you doing as some kind of centralized team in either the whole organization and part of it? What are you doing to intervene? Because that's the ecosystem you can control. And I do believe that you should focus on what you can control, and therefore the LMS, the LXP, the other technology you might have there, the processes, the practices, all of this, they are real factors that make a difference. The learning and problem solving is going on all the time, but if your ecosystem is what I'm describing as healthy, it will encourage and amplify this learning, and it will actually recognize it via recognizing skills and, of course, recognizing people through certifications. So that's what a healthy learning ecosystem does in terms of what the central L&D team can do to work with the goodness in the organization. An unhealthy learning ecosystem is one that actually frustrates the learning that happens organically. So people log into a system to try and find a certification or register for some learning, and hey, they can't do it, so they just kind of go dark, and it happens somewhere offline that you can't track. There's all manner of ways in which processes and platforms can actually impede learning, and that has a big effect overall, because if this learning infrastructure and ecosystem isn't in place, the organization struggles itself to learn. And then you often see this in the decline of organizations is often linked to their inability to learn as an organization and to develop new skills. Conversely, the resurgence of organizations is linked to changes in mindset around learning and knowledge. Microsoft is a great example of this, right? We've seen both phases of that pattern. I would also say that healthy ecosystems tend to be efficient. You wouldn't have in a healthy system one really bloated program swallowing up all of your spending and resources and starving other programs. That would be a good way to apply the ecosystem analogy. And we're going to talk more about this, but it's important to remember that the value of learning is actually balanced on a knife edge, really. The exact same content, the exact same experience, the exact same practice or program can really help an individual because it addresses their career goals or a problem they're working on right now, or it can do the complete opposite, because as soon as learning is not helping someone to do something better or achieve a career goal, it's of course wasting their time. And time is expensive.
True.
And learning L&D departments and can be their own grave diggers when there's too much of this wastage happening.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's a real cause of concern among everyday employees.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for elaborating. And what I'm making out of it is, if you look at it, a natural learning ecosystem is something like culture. It's existing even if you don't try to create one. So it's like, whether you consciously do it or not, culture exists. Similarly, some learning ecosystem exists, but L&D should be focusing on what they can influence. And you listed out a few points which make it a healthy ecosystem. The kind of experience it delivers, a better experience versus one that frustrates people. It should be efficient. It should be rewarding or recognizing people for what they're achieving in terms of certificates, etc. And finally, just be very conscious that the value is a very fine balance. It can tilt to a positive experience or a very bad experience, which, in my words, I normally try and put it as the brand that we are creating for L&D. And, every bad experience is actually just reinforcing that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great summary.
Fantastic. So we say curation and learning ecosystem. So you are obviously trying to bring curation as part of the ecosystem to make it efficient and achieve all of these things that you listed out are kind of attributes of a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, I would say so. There is a role that your content plays, I think, in the ecosystem that's quite important. Just think about different experiences that people might have. So, let's take one of the least optimal experiences. You have an academy intranet site or some kind of central hub for all learning, to navigate all learning. And then off of that, you have links into different content libraries. So maybe the business has an enterprise TED or HBR subscription. Maybe you have LinkedIn Learning, maybe you have Coursera. And when a learning need or skill development need arises, the manager asks the L&D coordinator for their area. This person feels there's value in learning Python, becoming certified in it. I can see the value too. What do we do about it? And they say, go to the Learning Hub, and find that content and just consume it yourself. We don't really know what's going to happen at that point. We might have a really good manager who's able to pick out a course for that user and for that person and enroll them in it. They might have personal understanding. They might have completed that course themselves. And so that could turn out really well. But it's far more likely that isn't going to be the case because, managers have whole teams of people who are experts in things they're not experts in. That's why they have a team. Anything could happen at this point. The person might click through and search for it and not get many results. They might find some intranet-based PDFs that don't really answer the question. They might actually find a course and complete that course, but then it could be the wrong kind of content for the organization. They could end up learning a development language that's being phased out because they have no idea that in the organization, because they have no idea, and they don't have a certification that's valued. So you start to see how the content in your ecosystem actually can create real problems, because if it's not adequately filtered and contextualized and arranged, every individual learning journey is going to look like this. And it's very hard to see how that could lead to efficiency overall it's just going to lead to inefficiency. I've heard it, dozens and dozens of times. When I search for this key topic, which might be something like growth mindset, and in return I get 200 results, how do I know which is the one the company wants me to do? And this is what's on everyone's mind. I can choose, but which one does the company want me to do? Because, hey, it makes sense. It's logical to want to complete learning that you feel is in line with the company's strategy, because at least one of your goals is to develop your career at the company. So it's not okay just to let people roam freely and be completely bottom up, because you're also withholding something from them. You're also saying to people, hey, we're not ready to tell you what our strategy means for this learning. You go and figure it out, and then we'll do some analytics and roll it up later. And I find that troubling, and it's allowed me to understand just how important something as simple as content can be, and therefore how important curation is.
So what I gather from there is, of course, in our experience, we have had two sets of challenges. One is identifying the need of training itself, which is where you said maybe the manager has worked with you to say, okay, this topic or this certification in the academy will make sense. So there is some amount of approval that has come in from the company. But then when it comes to the actual content pieces, which is where there are so many pieces, sort of a content overload that is there, and you're not able to choose which one should I go for. If it was just for my personal interest that I was doing, I could have chosen something which I just like based on rankings or ratings if they were available. But when I'm doing it from an organization's perspective, which has to align with this organization's goals, then I better know which one is better for the organization. So with curation, we are solving that part of the puzzle, which is finding the right content, which your team also wants, your manager wants you to do, but it also aligns with your organization's goals.
Yeah, it aligns with your organization's goals. And it does more than align with your goals. Think about the other aspects that make an organization work well. They are to do with culture, they're to do with brand, they're to do with philosophy. If you are a software development company and you have a software development philosophy, the more people who follow that philosophy in building software, the better your software is going to be. And it's not just following a certain set of rules or protocols. It could be a whole mindset, a whole belief system about the world. Okay, now think about how when an organization is launching something internally and they built the content themselves, maybe they're editing a video, how much effort goes into making sure that content tells the right story, the right belief system, what is distinctive about the organization who's made it. And now think about the mass of undifferentiated learning content where the solution to the problem is LinkedIn Learning, which is obviously completely, unless you happen to work for a company like LinkedIn or similar, it's of course quite neutral. It's not tailored. And so I think this is another area. Curation is not just about alignment to strategy. It's also about alignment to these softer areas of philosophy, politics, even things like gender are an important issue now. And we see that a lot, diversity, these things are very important. So there's all of that to get right. And these experiences might really start to undermine your efforts if you're not investing the time to understand this content and at least filter out the stuff that's completely, objectionable to what you're trying to do, right? Don't feature training content that's been produced by your immediate competitor in the market on the product you're trying to build, maybe, Yeah,
at least that much we can do. Yeah. No, it makes sense. Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So aligning both with the goals as well as the value systems and beliefs and maybe even business constraints, like you said, maybe you don't want to give a course which has been created by your competitor, etc. So what we are looking at, this curation is then helping an organization get, if they have some sort of development map or a plan that they have created for people, or individual managers have identified skill gaps for their teams, then after that, they can use curation to get the right content which meets these requirements.
Yeah, exactly. And I see curation as more than just the central team making smart filtering decisions. I think that's important, because if you are spending on a couple of big content libraries and it turns out that they overlap in important areas, there is a case to say, are we getting the best bang for our buck? We often measure content libraries on utilization, which is often quite poor, like any off-the-shelf content can be. But we don't quite look at them in comparable terms. So in the end, both libraries might have quite poor utilization. They also have advocates and champions, and they are both making a strong claim to relevance to the strategy of particular business units or teams. And the result is that we keep both. But if we can analyze that content library in comparable terms, if we can look at all of the content and say, does this match? Then you can make a smarter decision. Okay, so you might open up some budget, some space, some breathing room by doing that. But of course, L&D isn't really about, it's not about cutting costs. It's about maximizing the return on your spend, because all of us believe in this industry, but we should be investing more in learning and skill development, not less. And finally, the world is really waking up to that, I think, and that is what's happening, which is great. So I think curation goes beyond just centrally filtering and administering content and removing the stuff that's not relevant. There's a piece here about enablement, which is how enabled are managers, subject matter experts, anyone who might be involved in the learning process, and that's a lot of people. How enabled are they to curate well? Do they have a curation framework in place? Do they understand the value of contextualizing what they've curated for the situation? Curation is everywhere in society. It's an ongoing process, and not all companies, but many companies can trace some aspect of their own success to curation. I was thinking about low-cost supermarkets, like in European supermarkets like Aldi and Lidl recently, and they're seen as a cost cutter, and of course they are. That it's cheaper to shop there, but there's something else going on there, which is they're actually curation businesses, because rather than having big stores full of 5 versions of every product, they have small stores full of 1 version of every product, and that means choosing really well. So it's not as if people don't curate naturally as naturally as they learn, but that doesn't mean there isn't a value in recognizing it as a framework. And I think with the growth of the LXP space, we're starting to see what happens when you have a lot of curation that happens and there's no governance, there's no framework, there's no idea of how to optimize that, because then you get into the situation of noise.
Yep.
unhelpful knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, that's been something that it's been on my mind, and I think you wrote an article about LXPs becoming dumping grounds or dump yards, something like that, a couple of years ago, and that has really stuck with me, because yes, that's what some of our clients have experienced. Within a year's time, they would have so much of content, because everybody is just putting content out there, thinking that it is a better and an easier platform to learn on. And then suddenly you have that situation that you just mentioned earlier. You look for a particular topic and you have 200 assets available for that, and you don't know which one to go to. Maybe there are even duplicate versions created of the same content with different names for different geographies, for different languages, different things happening. So what's the trick there then? I heard one other thing just now, that it could be also people who are getting into that curation part, they need to have some mindsets around the right curation. So is it a combination of system as well as people? And what sort of a governance framework or curation framework? So maybe there are a lot of questions in one here, but how do people go about doing it in a structured manner?
Of course. And just to clarify, the article you referred to is published by Filtered. It was written by my colleague James Tyus, who really brought that to light. So everyone, please let's send that out in the show notes. I think it's a really amazing piece of thinking. So yeah, how do we go about changing it? We're talking really now about the governance of the curation process, I guess. And you're right that it's something to do with people and systems and ultimately to do with technology, but it's worth looking at things in that rough order. I don't actually think that the curation governance frameworks, I don't actually think that's content that exists in the public domain. I think it's more to do with things that the first generation of LXP customers have implemented and then have kind of developed in response to these problems. I'm not sure anyone has published anything like this. There are a couple of curation frameworks that have been released, which are about the process of doing it. I think that HT2 Labs had one called aggregation, distillation, contextualization, which is roughly what we do and is worth bearing in mind. Filtered also published its own curation framework a few years ago: understand, source, evaluate, publish, maintain, analyze. But these things are appropriate to managers of curation at scale. You know, we're still not getting to the heart of the problem here, which is the real question is who? Who is allowed? Who has the authority to curate, to publish a playlist or a pathway that may impact the experience of anyone who searches for that? We want to recognize the value, but we also have to recognize the negative too. The frameworks that have emerged, I think, vary from very formal to very informal and almost technology enabled. So the most common one I encounter is a formal designation as a knowledge category manager. There might be a few hundred of these people in a global organization, and they have one skill or one piece of knowledge. Say, that example of agile or growth mindset, they might be the expert for the organization expected to curate. That's one way of doing it. But I feel like you're going to lose a lot by just relying on a very formal structure, because that person may well not even enjoy doing that job very much. They might see it as an obligation, not a privilege, potentially, because they certainly won't be being paid anymore for doing it. Maybe they should be. Maybe there's part of the solution here as well to incentivize curation. That's an interesting idea. Not sure it would take off, but you can also be a lot more dynamic than that. So firstly, you can crowdsource curation. You can say, well, hey, everyone can curate on this topic and we're going to pick the best. So you can actually say, well, you might have an approval system where people can enter into this system. Or you could look at websites like Stack Overflow, where experts actually earn the ability to answer questions based on feedback to their existing contributions. So based on their reputation, or another way to look at it is based on their kudos in the system. And, Twitter is a bit like this, isn't it? You kind of earn kudos on certain things for the amount of retweets you get. I think that these are probably the future, but the right to curate should be earned and not assumed. And I'm not talking about private curation as well, because remember, learning is essentially a curation process. You get your resources, you make notes and you have your notes, and that's how you externalize the knowledge, and that's how you build your mental model. I'm not saying we're going to stop people from doing that, but I do think that decision to hit publish, we all seen what happened with the internet as a whole. So let's not allow that to happen in our organizations too.
Yeah. So some sort of a formal structure is useful. If I understood, like the one that HT2 Labs had, and you have a similar structure, but you also need something slightly informal. Otherwise, it could be very restrictive because only few people may be doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you broadening the pool of curators in the organization is clearly of huge value. So it's just a question of getting that broadening right and including the best people. The people who are going to really add value. And so it's, as I said, it almost needs to be seen as a capability that you're trying to enable across the organization, as opposed to a one-stop shop or a single fix.
Fantastic. So is there a something that I don't know, I mean, just kind of exploring, if you have tried to implement something like this for an organization which was really having a challenge of a lot of content, huge content overload, and then bringing a new framework of curation has really helped them solve that challenge. It'll be brilliant if there is a documented case study. Of course, people would love to read that and learn from that. But if anything, you can share from your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of there's a lot of case studies on our website, and there's a particularly long piece called Write Content that our CEO Mark wrote, which features embedded examples. But let me share a few with you. In one case, we are taking a very large set of content, all the libraries available, lots of internal content, and we're filtering it through our curation tagging process, and then we're supplying it in the form of a limited amount, like I think it's around 20,000 assets, into the organization that's essentially being uploaded directly into the learning experience platform. And it means that it's no longer an issue, the sifting, this control of the content. It doesn't have to be crowdsourced, or it doesn't have to be updated. We're using some technology to take a handle on that. The other main example of doing this, I guess, at the moment is helping organizations just make better buying decisions. So there's a particular moment in time where having analytics across all of your content is really helpful, because you're trying to decide whether you should renew a 3-year contract. And so our technology can step in then. And the other way I think we are working with clients is just helping them, those two examples are more like there's a mass of existing content that we need to filter. We need to launch a successful product per se that's efficient, and so we want the content to be right. But there's also this kind of retrospective analysis. So for another organization, we process transcriptions of all of their webinars that they'd run for a kind of a campaign of learning that involved many hours of content, and some of that stuff had to be used and repurposed, and other stuff maybe less so, based on the current strategy, because of course the strategy changes. And so our approach was to, well, let's analyze all of that stuff and let's tag it, and we'll give you an objective way to make the decision about which of the stuff goes on the LMS, the internet, to be used, and which doesn't. So yeah, it's a range of use cases, and I think that it's very much associated with LXP deployments of different kinds, because they all have this challenge of that there's going to be a lot of content here. How do we make sure it's just the Goldilocks amount of content, enough that the search queries are fulfilled, but not too much that there's too many results? And it's surprisingly difficult to do that. But I like to see it as transcending the LXP category as well, because LXP is not the front door to learning, right? It's a front door. It's like, it's nice. It's the nicest front door. But your house also has some patio doors. It has a back door. There's lots of ways into this stuff, and I think curation applies all along those every entry point.
Yeah, I mean just because I recall the LXP can also be, a layer over a layer over a layer over content in many cases. So you just need to dig a little too deep to find the right content. There have been organizations who've kind of, obviously you have an LMS, and then on top of that you have an LXP, and then maybe you have a CMS, and we spoke to one of our clients, and they had 8 clicks to reach a content bit, maybe because of library they were using. And so through the LXP you go to the LMS, and through there you get to the content hosting site, etc. So yeah, but absolutely, I think these are great use cases. Thanks for sharing, Toby. Before we go to the learning culture part, which is the other big piece of the topic today, I just want to quickly come back to when you said about the libraries that we have. You need to really curate from that based on alignment with the business goals, also aligning with the softer aspects, diversity and values and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Are you also seeing that sometimes an organization may actually be better off getting it custom developed? I mean, is that a decision also that's kind of influenced by what you get out of the curation?
Yeah, I love the fact you brought that up, because that's been a missing element in this conversation so far, which is creation, right? Making new stuff. And we've got a really there's a simplified view that's emerged of curation and creation, which is creation bad, curation good. Reuse what you have, don't make new stuff. Now that's not true. That doesn't work. Think about your own life or your own business, your own company, your own organization. The content we make defines us as people. If you're not going to make any content, you have no identity, at least no identity that can be externalized and written down and shared with someone. Of course, you need to make stuff. The question is, what should you make? And I think this is where curation comes in. Could you envision the possibility where a curation exercise identifies that 80% of your capability needs are covered by existing actually free providers, or maybe low cost content providers, maybe not the big hitters, and then you have a 20% gap? Okay, then you have a question, which is this 20% gap is likely to be the stuff that is pretty unique to our industry, perhaps maybe even to our organization. There might be a marriage made in heaven. There might be a perfect content provider, maybe started by someone who worked for your company in the past. He's like, I'm going to build the best library, and then great, off you go. You can have a conversation, and maybe that fills a gap.
Yep.
But actually, why not spend that money that you've saved on building and maintaining the very best internal library of content specifically to support those capabilities at your organization? And instead of covering a very broad array of topics and watering down the quality, you kind of dial up the quality and make it really inspiring content. And you only cover the topics that you can make a big impact with.
Yeah.
One simple example of this is making talking head style videos of very senior people in the organization, responding to a change or a major program, but investing in high production values so people actually enjoy the experience of watching that. That's something that happens already quite a lot, and I think we could take that approach to other areas too. If we're looking at changing the way the organization manages projects, then much of that mindset change is going to be covered by untraining people in one methodology and training people in another and bringing external stuff. But there is some content to be made there, and actually the curation process will help you identify where that gap is.
Fantastic. So if I were to rephrase that, maybe there is, based on curation and also maybe some sort of an analysis that you would do on what's unique to us in terms of capabilities and skills that we, maybe for the industry or for the organization, and what's most impactful. This program, let us not take it from the market, because this is the one which really defines the kind of impact that we have in whatever we do. Maybe organizations can see, these are the 50, 100 skills that we focus on, and these are the 5, 10 that we don't want to buy a library on. So are you kind of hinting at creating that sort of a matrix? It could be influenced by uniqueness, impact, maybe a few more factors, but those are the ones you are best off to do your custom development or bespoke development, and the rest you will probably find some decent content on libraries.
Absolutely. And that's pretty much the model. I would be thinking of my position at the moment. I'd be putting a product marketing lens on this and thinking in terms of positioning, which is all about understanding the really unique value driving things that your organization does and focusing on those things rather than focusing on imitating what other organizations do. And that what we've just described is definitely a really good version of that. The other point I'd add is that there is yet more time to be spent on creation because your creators are actually the best place to do the contextualization on the content that's been made. So, for example, the content, that's been curated as opposed to made. So, for example, I've got my SMEs and I've cajoled them into curating the best playlists on these topics. And I've got the playlist and the content's great. It's the best articles on these areas, the best resources, and I didn't have to build it. Job done. If they don't have good descriptions, good titles, and good hero images, that work will be wasted in a large proportion of cases because, hey, people are fickle. They need something to keep them in. So then I would say that's when you go back to your creation team and say your job now is to spend the whole day writing the best possible description of this playlist using language that will appeal to your learners. And then they've started to add value. So there's value even inside the curation process for creation, which is about getting that contextualization right.
That essentially goes into making it a better search. Eventually, curation is obviously at the heart of it. It is some sort of a search algorithm.
Yes.
And giving the right context and meta tags and descriptions is going to help that search and make the curation process more effective.
Exactly. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to do a webinar, a podcast, recording without repeating the Ben Evans quote that I always repeat, which is all curation grows until it needs search. All search grows until it needs curation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you are getting to solving that problem, because that's really becoming where you can't search it anymore. So all search is kind of getting towards more curation to be helping that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about you, but when I now look to buy a product of some kind, unless it's something very trivial, if it's something of high value, I'll probably read a couple of those these are the top 20 items in this category first. I don't quite rely anymore on search because there's so much abundance, so much to choose from, so much information that I don't know. And I think it's healthy that we're starting to see that behavior, migrate into corporate learning too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's get to the other part of our topic, which is the learning culture. So you talk about saying, curation and learning ecosystems, but essentially focusing on how to deal with the complexity that is possibly damaging the learning culture. So do you want to talk about what complexity and how is it really damaging the learning culture? Is just the content overload and not being able to find stuff that the complexity is, or there are more things to that?
It's not just content overload. We've already talked about the complexity of systems and how you might have multiple clicks, multiple logins to get to a single piece of content. That's a form of complexity that's bad too. There's also process-driven complexity. Approvals and sign-offs can be too complex. And for example, what about the budget that isn't spent every year? Large organizations, on average, they spend about $2,000, pounds, whatever, depending on the local currency, about £2,000 a year per person on training, and about £50 of that is spent on content libraries. And so when I talk about complexity, I have in mind the content library, because if that's wasted, that's a big sum, but the other sum is bigger as well. So, and actually not spending it is as problematic as spending it sometimes, because people are unable to access those budgets. So there's lots of different and interesting solutions and ideas out there to try and cut through that level of complexity. So you need to get back to looking at the individual user eye perspective of it's really the employee experience as opposed to, just a specifically learning experience, because they're really interwoven. I don't think that an average employee considers the compliance training they needed to do when they joined to be learning any more than they consider the career conversations they're having and their targets to try and get their next pay rise to be involved in learning. And yet we know that both of them really are. So it is helpful sometimes to lose that frame. I think that you have the existence of different personas inside your organization, which have radically different attitudes towards learning. They go all the way from people who are and have an antipathy towards any kind of learning or non-mandatory development, and they're human, so of course they do really learn, but you won't catch them on camera saying that, but they're very much like, unless you force me to do it or make it a disciplinary procedure, if I don't, I'm not going to do it. Okay, so there's that persona. And then at the other end you have, and I've done about 20 hours of interviews with users at different customers over the past year or so, and so this is what this kind of stuff is based on. And you have this self-directed learner who is a person, often a woman, usually a woman, who is spending really dedicated time every week to developing skills. It's really quite an amazing thing, actually, to realize that these people really exist, and they don't have to be cajoled into it by any kind of gamification or nudging. They allocate time, and one example was I allocate 1 hour. I also allocate another hour in case that hour is taken away from me for some reason, to make sure I get this skill development done. And these people, as I said, probably more female than male, are they are the future potentials of an organization, because they are the ones, often they're local learning champions and talent champions, as well as subject matter experts in whatever their area of specialism is. And then you have all the people in the middle. What I like to see for disorganized learners, like some people like me, I'm disorganized in terms of exercise. I can get into a bit of a swing of it, and then something happens and no, routine's gone. I need to get up to it. And these people are they're often on the table, I think, for our platform implementations. We're thinking, well, what can we do to nudge these people and develop more of a habit? And the fact is that all of these people encounter the complexity of the system in different ways, and all of them respond in different ways. For the person who only wants to complete the mandatory stuff, there's likely complexity in terms of the LMS system itself that they use. The assumption that people have to do it, so they will fight through the barriers to do it, is not helpful when you think that every time that person has to log in again or click off to a new window that disappears somewhere, or encounter browser incompatibility, they don't get happier just because it's mandatory. They're obviously going to get less happy, and that they'll be less effective on their next sales call, if that's their thing, for example, or their next management call. On the other hand, we also can't assume that the self-directed learners are happy either, because they are not. Believe me, they're not happy. These people who are the bedrock of learning and capability in organizations, who are spending the time every week, they have high expectations of the quality of systems that they encounter. They do want to know when they search, is this content validated? Is this for stuff that is in line with the strategy or not? They do want to be able to share content effectively with other individuals, and they do prefer for metadata to be up to date, and they want their search queries to be successful. So you can start to see how every user persona has its own complexity to deal with, and all of the complexity can be dealt with piece by piece, I think, but it might be better to pick one audience and really focus on them, as opposed to going for all of them at the same time. And controversially, I would suggest that the group in the middle, the disorganized group, it seems like the reward is there. If we could just move some of them into the self-directed category, we would have achieved a lot. Yeah. I would caution against that, because if we look at software, successful products are built on power users, people who use that product every day. They're not really built on the people who dip in and out. And so you might be better off targeting your efforts at the disengaged who just want to do their compliance training and really sorting that out, or you might want to target the self-directed users. But if you want to target in the middle, you better find another way to segment them, because it is going to be very complex in that zone. I hope that's helped. I want to publish some stuff on this soon to try and elaborate this theory of the 3 different types, because something I've learned over the years is that targeting everyone is just really doesn't go very well.
Absolutely. First principles of marketing. So what we are saying is there is complexity of different kinds, and there are learners of different kinds, if we can call them learners, right? People who are very motivated and people who are completely not interested unless you put the gun on their head. And each of them responds to complexities differently, right? And if we were to really focus on it, we can choose a particular group to focus on to improve or take them from where they are to the slightly better position. But how is this complexity, in as part of a topic, which is, it is damaging the learning culture? So are we saying that all of this complexity is just making people unhappy, less satisfied, feeling they're wasting their time, etc.? And hence that is leading to maybe a suboptimal learning culture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to measure these things in direct terms. A simple way to measure it is simply in terms of waste. If you're wasting money on things that aren't being used, if your utilization rates are low, participation rates are low, then that's a sign of waste, and that might be due to complexity. It might be that people are simply finding it hard to access. The best example of this is going to Google instead of going to internal resources. You either argue that the internal systems need to be good as good as Google, or you argue that there's some topics that we're not going to tell people to use the internal systems for, and we'll save that way. But I think and from our experience, we've seen that system and content complexity damages learning culture in a more insidious way, because if the systems are overly complex and overly formal, then learning can become a pantomime. It can become, a kind of dirty word in the organization. If your people are constantly enrolled in mandatory virtual sessions, so virtual now, of course, we used to be face-to-face, that take up to 20 to 30% of their week every week, do not expect those people to pursue learning independently that might actually help them in their job roles, because they'll be exhausted from all of them, and they're going to get some value from that stuff. I'm not saying it's not valueless, but if you remember the kind of knife edge analogy I used before, maybe any minority of people might actually get that value. So how do you make it more simple? How do you make it more authentic? And how do you make it more inspiring? I think the answers, and re-energize engagement with learning as a brand, I think curation is really the answer. I think it is cut half of the program on growth mindset that you're going to enroll the whole organization on, and focus the same budget on really well curated materials by the right people that will inspire and get conversations going. And you'll start to do things that resonate with the reality of what's happening on the ground, and break through the cynicism. Because some rituals are great and some institutions are great, and they help us a lot in our daily lives. But some institutions and rituals are really bad, and that's the complexity that I'm referring to, the complexity that saps the life out of systems. And we saw this, you can look at different brands, different organizations, and you can tell the high performing organizations, learning isn't a pantomime, it's a real expectation, it's a real understanding. And in the more bureaucratic organizations that suffer more from inertia and from difficulties in changing and adapting, learning is seen as a formalistic, bureaucratic process.
Is it correct to then say that the direction to reduce those complexities or remove them is to focus on the kind of experience ultimately that we are delivering to our learners?
I think that's a great starting point. Probably the only starting point if you want to make an impact quickly, and a really good starting point if you are trying to find what I would describe as another way, because I've been involved in lots of different attempts to reduce complexity over the years, and starting with a map of all the technology in the organization and thinking what is costing too much, what can we cut, what can we replace. It's one approach, and it's worth it to some degree, but you might miss some things if you do that.
Yeah.
You might miss that the tool that you want to replace with another tool to reduce complexity is being used in a fundamentally different way. And actually, there'll be a negative feedback loop from doing that, and you'll actually make things worse, not better. You probably end up spending more as well. You probably end up spending more money by making that swap or that change. So adopting the kind of employee eye perspective will not only let you understand how things really work, take a day in the life, but also there might be some unexpected benefits. I think that there are examples of when people have realized that it is in fact possible to say turn off the LMS. This was a famous example, because if they took the employee eye perspective, they could actually see that it wasn't really being used by anyone for anything. It was just it was an assumption of the system, and it could be removed. You might also find that this hard data integration that is going to cost you a lot of money and cause a lot of developers a lot of trouble is not necessary if you can have a little widget that floats in the bottom right of the screen saying, launch a mentoring conversation now. And that's how it connects to your talent system or your mentoring system. There's lots of clever ways around hard integrations that still have the same effect of reducing complexity, but they do it by putting some pixels on a screen, not by, some kind of data lake or data exchange process. So yeah, hacks.
Fantastic. Brilliant. I think it's been a great conversation, and I've learned so much about curation and how it can be used to support that right learning culture and build a great learning ecosystem. But I want to, before I let you go, I want to understand, when I read out about Filtered and what it is doing, and you say that you are implementing it through multi-channel campaigns. What do you specifically mean by that, if you want to share that?
Yes. So multi-channel campaigns is an unwieldy term. If I could think of a better one, I would, but I can't. So we'll stick with that. Why do campaigns need to be multi-channel? For the same reason that marketing campaigns need to be multi-channel. We know that a purchase decision is motivated by different encounters, different points of contact. You will see the brand physically in person. You'll drive past it, you'll walk past it, you'll see a Facebook ad, you'll get an email. It's hard to attribute cause and effect in that situation. And it's also kind of unnecessary. Any good marketer knows, get it everywhere your audience is, right? And that's why they need to be multi-channel. That's why I'm not going to say that getting it into Slack or just into Teams is the solution, or other, techniques of the solution. You need to have a strategy which encompasses all of them. We have always found that email marketing is still a really strong card to play if it's played well. And every single client requires some convincing, because no one really wants to send more emails, and I understand that. But again, this is where curation comes in. So think about the time, effort, distribution. I don't want you to send more emails. I want you to send less emails. I want you to invest 10 times the effort in sending 1/10 as many emails. So those emails are really, really, really good. Recently, we've been doing micro newsletters where it's just one piece of content, and that's the newsletter. One piece of content on whatever topic, usually to do with things like Internet of Things and digital transformation and transformation of supply chains, that sort of stuff. The best article that our data is telling us we have, and experts have validated it, and that's what goes to everyone, and that can generate some excitement. Email is now the bread and butter of curation. Most people have a few newsletters that they follow. If you're interested in this, look at newsletter marketing platforms like convertkit.com they help you understand how it all works, because they're people who are monetizing these newsletters. So I think that the multi-channel campaigning is a part of curation because it's about solving what is really the final stage of it in all of the models, which is distribution, deployment, whatever you want to call it. How are you going to do that? And putting the stuff that you're curating directly into the flow of work through targeted communications, through posting in online communities and Microsoft Teams, you can just skip the LXP step altogether if you like. If your goal is to generate change, you shouldn't be as interested in LXP engagement data. You should be interested in the other metrics that you're measuring. And so actually, like the marketer is interested in sales at the end of the day, and that's what they're going to be measured on. We could have a similar approach, and we could stop getting bogged down by did people actually click into the LMS or click into the LXP, and just focus on getting the message out there.
Okay, so essentially what I understand is a concept borrowed from marketing side, but applied to the learning systems that we have internally. And rather than focusing on an LXP or even an LMS, we could probably carry out campaigns which are reminding people on different platforms, maybe a blend of things that you're doing in that multi-channel campaign. But obviously the data analytics of that is different, and hence we just need to remodel what we are really focusing on in terms of analytics.
Yeah, and this change is actually happening now. I'd see, again, the kind of leader organizations, the large enterprises are starting to move from an idea of there's a platform, a hub where people go to develop skills, to realizing that skills are developed in work, in practice. And so what we're going to do is identify, you might call them subscribers to a skill, and we're going to send them really quality newsletters every week, every month, every 2 weeks. It just depends on the data. And we're going to generate engagement that way. And you're not actually losing data by skipping a step and skipping the platform build. Emails are a very rich source of data, because it's quite mature. You get a lot more data from an email. Think about the platforms that even tell you like where the mouse has been moving, embed certain, analytics cookies and trackers in there. So you can get a lot of data. And also email data is quite robust because these are often broadcasts. You sent it to a big audience. You can't hide, right? In an email, you've got an open rate, you've got a click-through rate, and that's it. You can't claim that, well, the adopted users use it 80% of the, that kind of stuff doesn't happen in an email. You've got an open rate and a click-through, and that's it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are, a few things that we can bring from marketing into L&D, and marketing has evolved quite a bit in the last decade or two. And there are a lot of things, both in terms of how to deliver it, how to structure it, and how to track it and measure it. All of that, is pretty relevant to what L&D is trying to do. Fantastic. Toby, it's been a lovely conversation. I really thank you for your time today. Great to get your thoughts on curation and learning ecosystems. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of this.
Thank you so much, Amit. I really enjoyed the conversation too. And thank you for the patience to push through and unpack my ironically overly complex title, because it's been a really great conversation.
Oh, I loved it. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day.
Great. All right. See you soon, Amit. Cheers.
Bye-bye.